How's it going, everyone? Austin Honecker here. I just wanted to come on here for a while and give my review for Dark Side of the Ring Season 4. This season, Season 4, had 10 episodes, and all the episodes were awesome from start to finish. Now, here's my review. For, um, for episode 1, it was called Chris and Tammy. Now, this episode was talked about Sonny and the late great Chris Candido. Now, this episode pretty much talked about Chris Candido, the late great Chris Candido and Sonny's relationship being high school sweethearts, and talked about the late great Chris Candido's starting the wrestling business and everything, and it talked about how Sonny got her start in the wrestling business as well, and it talked about the late great Chris Candido with his wrestling career in Jim Cornette's promotion, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and talked about how he went to WWE owned by Vince McMahon and everything, and talked about how he had success in Smoky Mountain Wrestling but didn't have success in WWE, and it also talked about how he went to the Indies and with little success, and talked about his career in Extreme Championship Wrestling owned by Paul Heyman, talked about his success there, and also talked about his time in Total Nonstop Action Wrestling, now Impact Wrestling, which was owned by Jeff Jarrett at the time, and everything, and it talked about how the late great Chris Candido and Sonny had trouble in their relationship because they ended up doing drugs and alcohol and everything, and talked about how they went in debt because Paul Heyman had them booking talent for the ECW shows and everything, and it talked about how Sonny cheated on the late great Chris Candido with Shawn Michaels and everything, and it talked about how Sonny became a manager, a photographer, then manager for the wrestling business and everything, and it talked about Sonny getting in a car wreck and killing a man and facing time in prison and everything, and it also talked about how the late great Chris Candido suffered an injury to his leg and had to have surgery and everything, and talked about how when he came back from the TNA show from the plane and came home and wasn't feeling good and ended up in the hospital and died from a blood clot and everything. Now, the people that were interviewed for this episode were Johnny Candido, brother of the late great Chris Candido; Peggy Ray, mother of the late great Chris Candido; Jim Cornette; Mick Foley; Dr. Tom Pritchard; Lance Storm; and Terry Runnels. Okay, episode 2 was called Shattered, the Magnum TA Story. Now, this episode was about Magnum TA and how he got his start in the wrestling business, starting off as a fan, watching wrestling with his dad, and talked about how he got into the business because he was working at bars and strip clubs before he started in the wrestling business, and talked about how the late Buzz Sawyer offered him $10,000 to start training in the wrestling business and everything, and it talked about how Magnum TA went to his parents to get $10,000 to go into wrestling. It also talked about how his mom went to his grandfather for the money, and his grandfather gave him the money, and then the late Buzz Sawyer disappeared and everything, and then it talked about how Magnum TA started in Championship Wrestling of Florida, the Mid-South, National Wrestling Alliance, and everything. And it talked about his success in the wrestling business and everything. And it talked about his marriage with his ex-wife, his marriage with his ex-wife, and how it went good at first, and then how it went south and everything. And it talked about how Magnum TA was set to win the NWA World Title and ended up in a car wreck and almost ended his life and everything, and how he was in the hospital from the car wreck and everything, and talked about how the doctors said he wasn't going to be able to compete anymore, so he still was involved in the wrestling business, but doing commentary and everything. And then talked about how he got away from the wrestling business and how he got divorced from his ex-wife due to infidelity, and talked about how he got married to his current wife and them having children, and what he's doing nowadays with making appearances at indie shows and conventions and everything. Now, the people that were interviewed for this episode were Jim Cornette, David Crockett, Magnum TA, Jimmy Garvin, Jake the Snake Roberts, Bill Apter, Tamara Howell, ex-wife of Magnum TA, Nikita Koloff, and Courtney Blanchard Allen, wife of Magnum TA. Episode 3 was called Breaking the Cycle, the Graham Dynasty. This episode was about the late greats Eddie and Mike Graham. This episode talked about how the late great Eddie Graham got his start in the wrestling business in the 1950s, and talked about how he had success as a professional wrestler, and how he ended up retiring from being a professional wrestler and became a promoter for Championship Wrestling of Florida, and talked about how he was rough on the talent and everything, and it talked about the late great Mike Graham getting his start in the wrestling business, following his dad's footsteps and everything, and it talked about how Eddie Graham teamed with Dr. Jerry Graham at one point in time, and then Dr. Jerry Graham being insane from carrying his dead mother's corpse out of the hospital, and the late great Eddie Graham getting away from the late Dr. Jerry Graham and everything, and it talked about how the late great Eddie Graham ended up with depression from all the stress of being a wrestling promoter and everything, and talked about his alcohol problem and everything, and it talked about how the late great Eddie Graham committed suicide due to multiple gunshots and everything, and it talked about how the late great Mike Graham coped with the late great Eddie Graham's suicide and everything, and it talked about how the late great Mike Graham took over the late great Eddie Graham's promotion, Championship Wrestling of Florida, and had no success and was bought out by WCW and everything, and talked about how the late great Mike Graham had a short stint with WCW but wasn't satisfied and left the wrestling business and everything, and it talked about how not only did the late great Eddie Graham commit suicide, but the late great Eddie Graham's father and brother committed suicide as well. It also talked about how Stephen Gossett, which is the grandson of the late great Eddie Graham and the son of the late great Mike Graham, it talked about him committing suicide due to gunshots and everything, and then it talked about how the late great Mike Graham grieved himself over not only his father, the late great Eddie Graham, but also his son, the late Stephen Gossett. And it talked about how the late great Mike Graham committed suicide due to multiple gunshots as well. And now the people that were interviewed for this episode were Nicole Gossett, granddaughter of the late great Eddie Graham and daughter of the late great Mike Graham, Jim Cornette, Kevin Sullivan, Dottie Curtis, and B. Brian Blair. Episode 4 was called What Happened to Doink the Clown. Now, this episode was talking about how... this episode was talking about the late great Matt Bourne. This episode was about the late great Matt Bourne and how he got his start in the wrestling business, under the tutelage of his father, the late Tony Bourne, and talked about his time in Portland Championship Wrestling and his time in WWE, his 2 runs in WWE and his run in WCW and his run in ECW and his time in the Indies and everything. And it talked about his characters, Maniac Matt Bourne, Big Josh, and then talked about his main character, Doink the Clown, and how it had success and everything, and it talked about his drug addiction and everything, and it talked about how he had a bad life growing up and how he had 2 bad marriages with both of his ex-wives and everything, and talked about how he ended up having a girlfriend and moved in with her, and it talked about his death in 2013 due to a drug overdose and everything. Now, the people that were interviewed for this episode were Tegan Osborne, daughter of the late great Matt Bourne, Michelle James, second ex-wife of the late great Matt Bourne, Mick Foley, Dr. Tom Pritchard, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, B. Brian Blair, Maria Straley, first ex-wife of the late great Matt Bourne, and Connie Cook, girlfriend of the late great Matt Bourne. Episode 5 was called The Junkyard Dog. Now, this episode was about the late great Junkyard Dog. And this episode talked about the late great Junkyard Dog and how he played football and then got his start in the wrestling business in the Mid-South territories and then eventually ended up going to WWE. Talked about his success in the Mid-South territories, but talked about his failure in WWE and talked about his drug addiction and everything. And it also talked about his death in 1998 due to a car wreck after missing his daughter, the late Latoya Ritter's graduation, and met up with the family and everything. And it talked about how he was on his way home and he ended up getting in a car wreck and the car flipped over and he passed away and everything. Now, the people that were interviewed for this episode were Jake the Snake Roberts, Jim Ross, Coco B. Ware, Mr. USA Tony Atlas, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, Jim Cornette, Teddy Long, Jarvis Woodburn Jr., nephew of the late great Junkyard Dog, and Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Episode 6 was called The Tragic Fall of Adrian Episode 6 was called The Tragic Fall of Adrian Adonis. Now this episode talked about the late great. Now this episode was about the late great Adrian Adonis. This episode talked about how Adrian Adonis got his start in the wrestling business and how he was a street fighter growing up and how he done a street fighter gimmick under his real name Keith Frankie, and talked about how he went to WWE and ended up doing the adorable Adrian Adonis gimmick, and talked about his drug issues and everything, talked about his drug addiction and everything, and then talked about how he got fired, how he left WWE and went back to the Mid-South territories and everything, and then talked about how he passed away in 1988 due to a car wreck because he was in the car with 3 other wrestlers, and that they were drinking and ended up wrecking the car and everything. It talked about how Adrian Adonis and three wrestlers all passed away from it, and talked about how only one of the wrestlers survived and everything. Now the people that were interviewed for this episode were Bret the Hitman Hart, Anthony Gugino, friend of the late great Adrian Adonis, Dave Meltzer, Greg Gagne, Jim Brunzell, B. Frankie Hall, widow of the late great Adrian Adonis, Gina Bana, daughter of the late great Adrian Adonis, Angela Paredes, daughter of the late great Adrian Adonis, Dan Spivey, Mike Kelly, and Ricky Johnson. Episode 7 was called Abdullah the Butcher, Legacy of Blood. Now this episode was about Abdullah the Butcher. Now this episode talked about how Abdullah the Butcher grew up in a poor home life, and talked about how he dropped out of school when he was in 2nd grade, and talked about how he couldn't read and write, and talked about doing karate, and talked about how he got his start in the wrestling business, and how he was brutal in the wrestling business by using forks and blades and everything in his matches, being hardcore and everything, and it talked about how he gave so many of the wrestlers Hep C from the blades and the forks and everything, and then talked about how he ended up in debt from a lawsuit from one of the wrestlers, and how he went in debt from his businesses and everything as well. Now, the people that were interviewed for this episode were Mick Foley, Hugo Savinovich, Josephine Huron, sister of Abdullah the Butcher, Ralph Shreve, brother of Abdullah the Butcher, Abdullah the Butcher, Mr. USA Tony Atlas, Jocelyn Malika Marshall, caregiver of Abdullah the Butcher, and Devin Hannibal Nicholson. Episode 8 was called Bam Bam Bigelow, the Beast from the East. Now, this episode talked about the late great Bam Bam Bigelow and how he got his start in the wrestling business, and how he played football before he started in the wrestling business, and talked about his time in WWE and WCW and ECW and everything, and it talked about his life outside of the wrestling business, and it talked about his death in 2007 from a drug overdose and everything. Now, Now, the people that were interviewed for this episode were Dana Breckenridge, ex-wife of the late great Bam Bam Bigelow, Richie Bigelow, daughter of the late great Bam Bam Bigelow, Diamond Dallas Page, Shane Bigelow, son of the late great Bam Bam Bigelow, Taz, Scott Colton Bigelow, son of the late great Bam Bam Bigelow, the franchise Shane Douglas, and Dave Meltzer. Episode 9 was called Bash at the Beach 2000. Now, this episode talked about the pay-per-view event WCW Bash at the Beach 2000, but it also talked about how WWE and WCW went at a ratings war and how WCW was on top for a few years and then WWE came out on top and how WCW went out of business and WWE buying them out and everything. And it talked about how Eric Bischoff and Vince Russo had to work together and everything and how they had different minds for the wrestling business and everything. And it talked about how Eric Bischoff wanted Hulk Hogan to be the WCW World Heavyweight Champion by having Jeff Jarrett drop the title to Hulk Hogan, but Vince Russo had other plans of wanting Jeff Jarrett to go over all the legends in WCW and eventually dropping the title to Booker T and everything. And it talked about how Hulk Hogan, Eric Bischoff, and Vince Russo had a creative meeting before the show, before Bash at the Beach, WCW Bash at the Beach 2000, and talked about how they all came to a disagreement, and then Vince Russo ended up having Jeff Jarrett lie down for Hulk Hogan, and it talked about how Hulk Hogan and Jeff Jarrett had their match for the WCW World Heavyweight title, and how Vince Russo came out and told Jeff Jarrett to lay down and told Hulk Hogan to pin Jeff Jarrett, and Hulk Hogan wouldn't do it. And then Vince Russo threw the WCW World Heavyweight title at Hulk Hogan, then Hulk Hogan pinned Jeff Jarrett, and then Hulk Hogan cut a promo talking about how Vince Russo was up to his bullshit and how WCW is in the shits because of him and everything. And it talked about how Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff left after the match and everything. And it talked about how Vince Russo came out later on and cut a promo burying Hulk Hogan, calling him a politician, a bald son of a bitch, and everything, and talked about how Hulk Hogan, how he was going to make the main event Jeff Jarrett versus Booker T for the WCW World Heavyweight title and everything, and it talked about how Eric Bischoff had plans of having Hulk Hogan win the WCW World Heavyweight title, but coming back at Halloween Havoc and announcing that he's still champion, WCW World Heavyweight Champion and everything. But it also talked about how Booker T and Jeff Jarrett faced off in the main event for the WCW World Heavyweight title, and Booker T going over and becoming the WCW World Heavyweight Champion. And it talked about how Hulk Hogan sued Vince Russo for defamation of character and everything because of Hulk Hogan having full control, having creative control over his storylines and matches and everything, and talked about how Hulk Hogan wanted out of WCW and everything, and then talked about how WCW eventually how WCW was eventually demolished and bought out by WWE and everything. Now, the people that were interviewed for this episode were Vince Russo, Dave Meltzer, Eric Bischoff, Jeff Jarrett, and Lance Storm. And episode 10 was called The World According to Marty Jannetty. Now, this episode was about Marty Jannetty, and it talked about how Marty Jannetty got his start in the wrestling business and how his friendship with Shawn Michaels came about and how they formed the Rockers and everything. And it talked about how Shawn Michaels and how Marty Jannetty and Shawn Michaels got fired from WWE because of their nonsense at the bar and everything. And it talked about how the Rockers were successful as a tag team and how the Rockers broke up and everything. And it talked about how Shawn Michaels had success on his own while Marty Jannetty didn't have success on his own and everything. And it talked about how the Rockers reunited for one night only and how Marty Jannetty blew the opportunity of coming back to WWE and everything. And it talked about how, and it also talked about Marty Jannetty's injury in the wrestling business and talked about his trouble outside of the wrestling business and talking about his Facebook posts and how he went to jail and everything. Now, the people that were interviewed for this episode were Marty Jannetty, Al Snow, Leland McCluskey, orthopedic surgeon, George McCluskey, orthopedic surgeon, Karen Walker, friend of Marty Jannetty, Mean Mike Moran, Pat Tanaka, Brutus the Barber Beefcake, and Missy Beefcake, wife of Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Now, like I said at the beginning, all 10 episodes were awesome from start to finish, and hopefully Dark Side of the Ring gets a season 5, because I love this show, and like, I was iffy on this show there. I was iffy on Dark Side of the Ring there at first, but as I started watching it, I got hooked. And now it's my favorite TV show. And it's interesting at that. Excuse me. Now, I already said who all was interviewed for each episode, but the narrator for all of season 4 was Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho done awesome as the narrator. Now, like I said, I hope Dark Side of the Ring get a season 5, because they've had 4 seasons so far. Season 1 had 6 episodes, Season 2 had 10 episodes, Season 3 had 14 episodes, and Season 4 had 10 episodes. So if Dark Side of the Ring get a season 5, I'm anxious to see how many I'm looking forward to seeing how many episodes they're going to have, because they're going to be awesome from start to finish as well. Now, anyway, I just wanted to come on here for a while and give my review for Dark Side of the Ring Season 4. Like I said, it was awesome from start to finish. Hopefully a Season 5 happens. I have my fingers crossed for it. Now, anyway, with that being said, my name is Austin J. Honecker, and I will catch your fucking ass down the goddamn road. With that being said, peace out.